Previously on InnerZension Radio.
We are experiencing, as a society, a crisis of dream deprivation. Not only are we getting less sleep, but the quality of our sleep is declining. It is not allowing us to cycle naturally through the sleep cycle to get to those deep stages where you can also have the deep dreaming, which is also the most recuperative portion of the sleep night.
Welcome to InnerZension Radio.
Welcome back. I'm Chris McClary with another episode of InnerZension Radio. The ancient Chinese healers were always talking about meridians and energy lines within the body. Sounds so very esoteric, and in today's culture, it is moving back towards including this sort of notion. But it almost sounds like electricity lines running through the body. And we have abandoned that view for quite some time in Western culture, thinking that the body is much more made up of chemistry. But in reality, there is more of a mix between the two. And clearly, we can see electricity running through the body simply by looking at the nervous system. So there is at least some sort of energy movement in the body. And that's why I wanted to have an energy healer on the show. Her name is Joy. I'm going to fully introduce her in the actual podcast, but for now I wanted to introduce more of just the energy work, because the Chinese believed that suffering or disease started based on blockages of energy. So this energy flows freely when we're relaxed, but it starts to degrade, it starts to get blocked up in different areas, and then wherever that blockage is, there's disease that flows out of that. So in general, this is very poignant for those seeking inner peace, if nothing more than just seeing where our tension is. The tension is where we are resistant to life itself, or this is where we are resistant to seeing the problems or dealing with the problems, or we are wishing away the problems. This is the basis for resistance. So resistance is something that energy healers try to locate, and then they typically are looking for reasons why it's there, so that you can work through that, so you can change your behaviors, so that you can approach that area of life with much more acceptance. So without further ado, let's get started with our show. And I want to encourage you to look into Joy's work more in depth, because there are some very special gifts there. And she has a very special talent in helping people heal themselves. And I have with me a joyful human being. Her name is Joy Caffrey. And let me go over just a brief summary of who this wonderful person is. She's a graduate of Rhode Island School of Design. She's a visual artist. She became a graphic designer, New York City, Seattle, New Mexico. She's been all over. She got her energy medicine training back in 1994, which makes her over 25 years practitioner in energy medicine and energy healing. She calls her calling to be deeply present with her client and reflect back to them the radiance and ease their shame and self-judgment. She moves through life with curiosity, an open mind, and compassion. She also has 3 grown children. She's in an empty nest with her husband, Tim. Joy, welcome to InnerZension Radio.
Thank you, Chris. I'm delighted to be here with you.
Now, I am reading all this information that you've given me. I thought I had enough, but there's even more. And what is an unbelievable bridge from the first episode? Actually, I've got my numbers wrong. This is going to be the third episode. The second episode was our dream specialist, J.M. DeBoard, and he was talking about how dreams were bringing in from the subconscious into our conscious mind. And reading directly from one of your healing papers, it says helps. Okay, so she's talking about how she helps clients, but helps you move information from your subconscious into consciousness. Joy, just tell me a little bit about how and why this is so important to bring what's in the subconscious out into awareness.
We don't want to self-sabotage ourselves or run programs that come from perceptions that we received as a child that maybe aren't aligning us with our full truth. And when we can move information from the subconscious into consciousness, we could see what's running the show. For me, it's really easy to tap into or to move that veil between consciousness into the subconscious, into the unconscious, into archetypal conscious and divine consciousness. And that active work where Carl Jung was really put his subject of his work to. So I love moving that information up so that we can be in life with clarity, with an ease of being, with an ease of presence, without this underlying tension or anxiety that we don't even understand where it comes from.
Mm-hmm. And Carl Jung apparently said something to the effect that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. So we move about life as if it's as if we're just living out some or being orchestrated by some other power, and really it's just ourselves and our programmed subconscious. And it just seems really dark and heavy and scary to some people to dive in there because they know where they've been, they know what experiences they've had, and the last thing they want is to relive those experiences. Do you have situations where people maybe are forced to finally resolve this by way of reliving the past, or is it a little bit different than that in these sessions, these energy sessions?
I do think it's a little bit different than that. So I have a couple things to say. One thing that I had heard once, and then I've really watched the truth of it unfold before me, is what was absolutely essential to us as a child becomes detrimental to us as an adult. And what was essential is some of our ego strategies of how we figured out to navigate life. And that's some of what resides in the unconscious. And the reason that it becomes detrimental to us is because when we were a child, we were dependent on our caregivers and our authorities being outside of us. So we created strategies that our ego developed to work with and navigate our perceptions of what's coming towards us in life, always based on an authority being outside of us. So part of why we want to uncover what's in the unconscious is so that we can be able to become our own authority. And that's part of what transformation is. It's letting go of those childlike ways that were so necessary for our early development survival, and now be able to run our own show and captain our own ship. And unfortunately, those neurological pathways for those strategies that we created as a child are so deeply grooved in our brain. And so part of that moving what's in the unconscious into consciousness is an allowing for creating new neurological pathways that let us captain our own ship and let us navigate life from a sense of being centered in our own truth.
So in a way, it almost sounds like bringing up this garbage or the shadow or the darkness below is not a heaviness and having to experience and re-experience, but rather almost a freeing effect.
Mm-hmm. Actually, I love a quote from Rick Carson, who says, "I free myself not by trying to be free, but by simply noticing how I'm imprisoning myself the very moment I imprison myself." And so some of that, it's like, how do we stop or inhibit our own radiance, because that's what was necessary as a child. And so we learn how to reframe or open back up to, where we've held limits on ourselves. And I think each family of origin limits us in different ways. Like in some families of origin, it's like, don't wear your heart on your sleeve, so don't express yourself. Or in some families, it's don't act like a know-it-all, so you're told not to use your intelligence. Or don't be so bold with your sensuality. So we get different messages along the way that we then start to limit and make ourselves smaller and less than what we really are. And those are forms of imprisonment. And so in this work, we allow ourselves to release some of those messages or constructs that we got and allow ourselves to actually see what they are. And so in the work that I do, it's a lot of reframing and then also a gentle healing. And the healing doesn't have to be a reliving of everything. It's an understanding of how it got there and how to rework it.
Let's take a step back for our listeners and just get a better sense for what it is that you really do, because as you know, as an energy healer, kind of, people do make assumptions about what those are, but I'm sure there's lots of different modalities of energy healing. And what kind of modalities do you use, Joy?
I studied energy medicine for 2 years, 25 years ago, and then I just kept learning more and more in various forms of healing modalities. And so over the years, I've integrated them. But so much of what it is a deep sense of presence, listening, and then also a translation of what's happening within somebody's energetic field. So for my sessions, what I do is I meet with a client, I sit with them, and we talk or dialogue, and I'm listening to what they're saying verbally, but then I'm also listening to what they're saying on several other non-spoken levels, whether it's just including body language, but also energetically what's being said. And then when it feels right, I take my client to a massage table, although it's a close-on experience. And then I move in and out of using some sound. I use sound in my healing work, silence, and dialoguing with my clients. And we weave in and out of what's wanting to rise into an awareness. And so I do that in various ways. I can give you an example of something that happened today, or I could pause and let you catch up with, tell me what you're wanting to know more of.
Yeah, please feel free to continue on this little journey that you've got going.
Mm-hmm. So, for example, today I live in Fayetteville, where there's the University of Arkansas. And so sometimes I'll get students that come in from a lot of stress of just having done exams. And I had a student this week, the exams were already finished, but she kept dwelling on how she might have done or thought she did, or or just even what her disposition was when taking the exams. And as she's sharing all this with me, what I'm recognizing is her level of expectation of herself, and not only the expectation of her grade, but the expectation of how she felt while she was taking the exam herself. And then in listening to her more about some of her other stories or things she's telling me, I'm recognizing, oh, she's a really quick expectation generator. That's the word that we just came up with in our session. And then when we went to the table, it just helped me to recognize what is her unconscious wanting? So, she was feeling maybe anxiety about not getting a grade, but really what the expectation points us to is what need is really wanting to be met. And so in looking at it, like the obvious might be, oh, well, the need is to get an A, and she's stressing over that. But when you allow the body work to happen and connecting to her higher self wisdom, letting her, the information that was coming was allowing her to pause, to look at the expectations that's rising with her, help her find the need that's under it. And the need isn't just an A, like perhaps the need is a need for competency, a need for a sense of composure as she's taking a test, a need for a sense of mastery. And when we help someone point them to their needs, I can help them find other strategies to meet that need instead of getting fixated on one particular strategy. Like getting an A is one strategy for her to meet those needs. But so in the energy work, I help my clients to uncover what the tension or the anxiety or the depression is really pointing them towards. And I use a lot of Marshall Rosenberg's work of nonviolent communication or compassionate communication to help my clients look at their feelings, help them uncover their needs, recognize that there's an infinite strategies to get those needs met, and have their higher self-wisdom connect them to maybe the best way to have those needs met.
Is it fair to say that you have, or these people are seeking inner peace, and that anything keeping from them from the inner peace is what you're working on, or is that kind of a stretch?
No, I definitely think people want to have relief from anxiety, relief from their guilt or shame. And when one feels a sense of relief, they are able to get to a place of inner peace or inner joy. And I think it's important to discover that life is going to come at us with complexities and challenges, and learning how do I stay centered or have an inner peace even when there's some form of chaos going on, or how can we experience joy even when life isn't what our expectations are wanting, or when our idealized self wants to make it be so.
Right. That's exactly what we're envisioning with InnerZension, is a sense of core peace that follows with you or is inside of you everywhere you go. And the joy, the eternal flame is still there, and it never dies depending on some catastrophe or events outside of you. But it can't be done with repression, and it can't be done with just ignoring problems. And so I think what's happening for a lot of us is that we tend to get caught up in one of those. Let me read this another sheet that Joy gave me from her healing center. And it basically, if you want to mentally look at these as blocks to inner peace, she didn't really say that. She says that this is from why the use of services of an energy healer and kind of the issues that they resolve. But look at these as potential ways of blocking or preventing inner peace from happening. You have physical issues from like chronic pain or surgery or pain management. Then you've got emotional issues, feeling stuck, feeling overwhelmed, anxiety, anger. Then you've got mental issues, inability to concentrate, too much chatter, racing thoughts, fogginess, heart issues, and empathy, and feelings of love, and feelings of belonging. Then you've got spiritual issues, maybe loss of one's purpose or your higher power, or feeling disconnected from your higher power. And what about change? She's got annotated dealing with change. So change is so prevalent in our lives. And then personal growth issues, understanding how to use, your energy and keeping that energy flowing. If you imagine all these different kinds of areas where our energy could get blocked, and anytime, is it fair to say, anytime your energy is blocked, you would have a hard time having pure inner peace?
Yeah, and I want to comment in two different directions on what you just said. So
Sure.
First of all, I always like to reframe energy blocks as a package of information waiting to come into consciousness. And what it's waiting for is the right quality of listening and being tended to. And so as a healer, what I do is I find that vibration of what quality of listening is needed for this particular information to come into consciousness for my client. And I help guide them to that same quality of listening for within themselves. How can they be most present for something to reveal itself? And then I'll come back to that too. And then in terms of what you're talking about, an example that I personally like to give about talking about having an inner joy, even when life throws you something really challenging. One of my most, a really joyful moment for me, or experience of moments, was when my husband's brother Dan died. And one would typically think that's not a joyful moment at all. But my process of being present to his death, and he was one of the uncles that our kids were most closest to, and we, as soon as we found out about his death, we jumped in the car and drove the 12 miles to New Mexico, and was very present with his wife. I was very present being in that space, and ended up even coordinating the ceremony where we gathered 100 people, at his service. And although it was an incredible time of grief, it was also a deeply, I actually experienced it as joy. And the joy was because I allowed myself to be so deeply present to the grief of his wife, to the family of the gathering, to even I took myself even into the actual space of where he had his heart attack and placed myself there. And so I want to say that it is possible, like no matter what's going on around you, to be able to experience both its pain and understanding its suffering, and be fully present and alive with a joyfulness of experience, of presence, of being present to something.
That's very well said. I find it amazing that just earlier today, when I was teaching a group, I offered that very kind of advice in my own words, of course, and I used the grief example because I had been through grief several times in my life, and it wasn't until the last experience with grief where I knew about this process, where it's first allowing, it's surrendering to the emotion, it's fully experiencing this emotion, but not fully, but just not only fully, but deeply, and deeply being present to it without judging it, without trying to shun it away, without trying to stunt it, or okay, it's good now, can we move on now? Nothing like that. Not trying to make it faster, not trying to ease it at all, just letting it consume your body without doing anything. So a lot of us, distract ourselves away from it, like turn on the TV or turn on the music or make food or drink or use drugs, numerous ways of trying to distract yourself away from it. But what I offered was that I did have a sense of, and I hate to say this word because it kind of gets overused in certain circles, but a genuine sense of bliss as I was grieving. And it was kind of bizarre. It was very bizarre because I had never experienced that before, but it had to do with completely immobilizing myself so that I could feel this emotion very deeply and attune all my mind, my body, everything was attuning to that grief. And in that middle of the hurricane was a sense of purposeful bliss that was offered. And since then I've noticed that, I try to remember to fully experience each one of these emotions, but the deeper, bigger emotions are where these big bliss points are. So there's almost a gift in the bigger emotions. And if you allow yourself to feel those, you get the other gifts of inspiration, creativity, insight, and awareness. So
yeah, I want insight that came from being so deeply present to my brother-in-law's death my brother-in-law was a big man physically, but also jovial, and he had incredibly large personality. And so when I was really wondering, like, the first days when I arrived at his house after his death, it's like you felt that vacuum of his presence missing. And I remember going the next 3 or 4 days of like, wow, like what happens to that energetic space, that vacuum of where his presence was. And a most beautiful witnessing that I watched was the nieces and nephews, the teens and the 20-year-olds and the 30-year-olds, they all grew in those 3 days. I just watched their presence. They showed up in ways they've never showed up before. They, were helping out in ways they've never helped out before. And I watched the next generation get just a little bit bigger. And it was just a beautiful thing to watch. And I don't think I could have been present to it unless I was open to allowing myself the fullness of the experience of the grief and being present to it.
In other words, the being an energy healer, where you must, in order to be successful, you must be present to each client that comes in the door. And so you get the practice day in and day out of being present. Is that gave you the practice to enact it in your own life, I guess?
Yeah, and being sensitive, holding space. Yeah, I think as an energy healer, that learning to be deeply present moment by moment and holding space for someone's process without changing it or judging it or allowing for it to be while offering them guidance and reframing, and that shows up inside my office and then hopefully as much as I can walking outside of my office in my daily grind, allowing for that quality of presence.
And then taking it just a little bit further, if I may. So if you're intuiting and understanding this energetic status, if you will, then the next step in what I call unconditional love is to communicate what you understand about that person and that you accept everything there. It's very Carl Rogerian is what we call it. And that to me is the ultimate of unconditional love. In other words, I totally understand what you're going through, what you're feeling, and what your inner state is, and I accept that without judgment. I don't need you to be somebody else. I don't need you to be something. I don't need you to feel something else. I don't need you to stop crying. I don't need you to stop grieving. So.
Right. Yeah. And that's I don't need to fix you. I don't need to put a time frame on your process. Yeah. One of the things I've loved watching in my energy work is really recognizing that people have a different metering of how they process whatever they're experiencing. And part of my job as a healer is to meet them in their metering and be present to that without rushing them or slowing them down.
Yeah. Before we get too late, I want to hear a little bit more about your actual work and kind of some stuff that you see. Do you recognize certain blocks? Do you recognize tension in some of the pathways in the body? And are those the kind of insights that come out? Do you see visually, or maybe the third eye? What is your tool for assessment?
I'm extremely kinesthetic and I use sound. So in my sound, sometimes I put out sound and sometimes it's like being a whale or a dolphin where I put out sound and I receive information back. So that's one way that I receive information. I also see myself as a translator of information. And people wonder, I guess I translate clairvoyance to be that I'm just being a translator of what's already in their field, and people's energetic field extends off of their body. It's not just the dense molecular structure of the matter that makes up their body, but also the molecular structure off of their body. And so when I place my hands on someone, and I always go through, I want to say that I always go through a little ritual before I work on each and every client of getting ego out of the way, allowing myself to open and connect to all forms of divinity and perception, and placing myself in service fully to that client. And then once I do that, I receive perceptions in different forms. So I might see information. I work a lot with active imagination with my client. I might get directives or words of information. Songs might come up. So I receive information in many different forms, but I'm also from when a session starts to when a session finishes, I am making sure that I can have energy flowing evenly and with the good amount of quality and quantity through all of their chakras. And so when I'm holding the soles of the feet, I want to make sure that I can feel energy running all the way down. If I'm at their head, I want to make sure I can feel energy running all the way up, energy from the front and the back of their bodies. And to me, I'm just tactile sensitive, and it's really easy for me to feel whether energy is flowing or not flowing. And it's almost like if you think of it as a hose, like, is it just dripping out? Like sometimes a client could be not being able to modulate, and it's like it's way too full force for them to be able to process. And so I'm making sure that the quality and quantity of energy moving through their body is one that's most effective for their own vitality. And so that's something that's easy for me to sense and affect through the energy touch and healing.
Beautiful. Now, is there anything that you can suggest to the listeners that some of these things that they might be able to do on their own? Maybe a quick little technique of opening up chakras or identifying tension areas or that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think I probably pay attention to my chakras or sensing my energetic field like so many times throughout the day, and then I have to remember that, oh, other people don't do that or don't know to do that. So I'm always checking my own energy flow. Or I think a good place to do it is at red lights, because we are always driving in the car and we always see these red lights. So it's this nice little trigger to just take a moment when you're at a red light to take a cleansing breath. Check, how are your hands on the steering wheel? How tense are you? How tight are you? Can you soften your body in that moment to be using, just the right amount of energy that you need for driving, and not too much or too little. And that can be applied to anything. So paying attention to, how am I using the energy in my body? Like when you're doing the dishes, or just, I really like taking energy work and bringing it into the practical, into the everyday life. So paying attention to how are you feeling and sensing, opening up your sensing within your own body. Where is your tension? Can you bring breath awareness into it and soften it? And to remember that everything is information. So even that tension is information. So giving yourself permission to bring your awareness to the tension. Ask, be curious, have a beautifully curious mind, and ask, what is this tension wanting to tell me? Where is it coming from? What is it pointing me towards? What need wants to be met, is yearning to be met? So I think what I do for myself, or what I offer my clients, is ways to be curious, to pay attention, to open to what is, to accept reality versus trying to make it be what their idealized self wants. I could go on and on, so I know I talk a little.
Well, these are excellent. These are things that we could be doing all the time, almost watching us resist life.
Mm-hmm.
And then that resistance gives us clues about, well, maybe some of the subconscious defense mechanisms that we might have, and what it is that where those coping skills represent needs of our subconscious mind in a way.
Yeah. And I like to tell my clients, like, we don't have to like reality, but when we can accept reality, we can navigate it more easily, and we can bring in our gift sets versus our defenses.
Yeah, I don't think that inner peace is at the helm, or is not available to any of us if we're always resisting life. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we're getting to the end of the show, and we're going to have Joy back on at some point before she releases her book. And so when she comes back on next time, be watching out for her episode, because give us a little flavor, just a brief summary of the book and what we can expect from that next episode, Joy.
Mhm. The book is called Your Radiance Revealed, Keys to Release Fear, Shame, and Guilt So You Can Live Joyfully. And in the book, I help people to understand what their own suffering patterns are, their tendencies or their defaults, and how they relate to energetic patterns, and the tools that they can use to first recognize the pattern, and then how to come out of that pattern and slide more into their radiance. And if it was so easy to slide, we'd all be gurus, but we happen to bump into our own barrier material, our own shame and fear and guilt. And so the book is about how do we diminish that or navigate through that with more ease and step fully into our radiance.
That sounds blissful, to say the least. How do people get a hold of you, Joy, if they're more interested in more information or getting a session with you?
They can reach me through my website is joyfulhealingcenter.com, and they can reach me at joy@joyfulhealingcenter.com. They can find me on Facebook, and also my phone number is 479-409-4912.
Awesome. And I'll put these links in the show notes for everybody. And I just want to say thank you so much for your time, Joy. And I can't wait to hear about this book. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Chris, for taking time with me.
Okay, we'll see you next time.
Welcome to InnerZension Radio.